Ladies and gentlemen, of course, welcome everybody from across the shores to this great occasion. It's rather a farce, actually, having to introduce a man who needs no introduction. But for those of you from across the pond who've probably never heard of him, frankly, I don't know where you've been the last few years if you haven't. Boris Johnson is Mayor of London, and he's now an MP, so his sort of land grab is getting bigger, and there's all sorts of rumour he's going to be Prime Minister, but, you know, let's park that to one side for the moment. He is, of course, the best-selling author of a fantastic book at £25, a bargain, absolute bargain, called The Churchill Factor. Did you pay me to say this, by the way? I did. And all I can say is I've known him as a friend for quite a long time, and the only conversation we ever have is, as we've just had now, is, Marland, you need some training of your backhand for the tennis court. I will tell you the score of the last time we played. It was 6-2, 6-2. So I think the training of the backhand on the tennis court is all for you, Boris. And coming up for Wimbledon, I'll train you for that, because that's another thing that you can win in time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, can I borrow a copy of that? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very, very much, Jonathan, for that long and broadly accurate introduction. Great privilege to be here this morning at this important Churchill conference. And I realise that many of you may be following what Jonathan has said. Many of you from across the Atlantic and elsewhere will be looking at me in a rather sceptical way, because you will have gathered that I've been entrusted with very considerable public office already and have just acquired further responsibilities. And you may ask yourselves reasonably, by what extraordinary conceit and effrontery I was persuaded to accept an invitation to add my pebble to the mountain of Churchillian scholarship. And the answer, of course, is I accepted like a shot when Hodder invited me, because I thought that I knew about Churchill. After all, my father used to recite Churchill's speeches to us when we were kids. I'm sure you all had the same sort of experience. My brother and I had a Churchill picture book that we used to pore over so intensively that we could recite the captions. And I sort of grew up with Churchill, so I thought I knew all about it. And yet, the more I read over the last few years, and the more I thought, the more I have felt, and to continue my mountain metaphor, like some Himalayan climber who scales what he thinks is the summit, only to see a new peak glimmering dim and vast ahead of him, and then another and another. For instance, I knew that Winston Churchill had been brave as a young man, but I had not realized he was the only prime minister in our history to fight in battle on 4 continents, and I had no idea quite how many people from the developing world, countries with which we try now to have friendly relations, he had personally dispatched, always, of course, with compassion and regret. I knew that he had been there right at the beginning of the Royal Air Force, the founder of the Royal Naval Flying Corps, but I'd never understood, I'd never really grasped that he had begun to fly a plane barely a decade after those machines were invented, and he kept going up in these rope and canvas and leather death traps when he had the most terrifying prangs, and when his wife Clementine was begging him to give it up, and when one trip in 5,000 ended in death. And for the ease of comparison, your chances of dying on a bicycle in London are 1 in 14 million, and getting smaller the whole time, by the way. And I knew. So that was the kind of guy he was, and I discovered all this, and I knew dimly, because I'd read about it when I was a kid, that he'd fought in the First World War. But I was amazed in the course of my researches to discover that he had been out into no man's land 36 times and got so close to the Germans that he could actually hear them talking. I knew, of course, that he was energetic, but I didn't fully appreciate the unique biorhythms that drove him, that he drank a pint of Pol Roger a day, that he smoked 250,000 cigars over his lifetime, and actually He didn't quite smoke all the cigar. If you remember, he gave the stubs of the cigar to his gardener at Chartwell, who, the poor fellow, unfortunately contracted cancer. But he had a prodigious appetite of virtually every kind. And to finish the day, he would have a colossal dinner accompanied by red wine, white wine, brandy, liqueurs, and then began dictating to his secretary at 10 p.m., and he thereby, with that technique of composition, won the Nobel Prize for Literature, earned more places in the Dictionary of Quotations than virtually any other 20th century author, and wrote more words, not just than Dickens, not just than Shakespeare, but more words than Dickens and Shakespeare combined. And of course I knew that he was funny and that he was politically incorrect. But I don't think I'd really grasped that so many of these stories weren't actually apocryphal. They were true. It turns out that it's absolutely true that when he was on the lavatory and told that the Lord Privy Seal wanted to see him, he did indeed say, or did he give instructions to tell the Lord Privy Seal that he was sealed in the privy and could only deal with one shit at a time and so on. And when a female socialist MP called Bessie Braddock told him he was drunk, he really did reply with a rudeness that would be unthinkable today in the modern House of Commons, from which I've just come to see you. He really did tell her that she was ugly and he would be sober in the morning. You could not get away with that today, and quite right. And it really is true. It turns out to be really true that, and I have it from no less an authority than Nicholas Symes, that when, is he here, by the way? No. Okay. There's no risk of contradiction. You've heard, what's that?
He's heard this speech before, so
When a Conservative minister, not Jonathan Martin, obviously, but when a Conservative minister was caught with a guardsman on a park bench at 6 o'clock on a February morning in Hyde Park, the famous story, the chief whip was sent down to Chartwell to break the bad news to the Prime Minister, and he walked into Churchill's famous office where he was standing at his upright desk and told the Prime Minister these unfortunate sequence of events, and it was likely to get out. The press had got hold of it, the usual thing. And Churchill, without looking up from his papers, said to the chief whip, at 6 o'clock in the morning, yes, Prime Minister. On a park bench, yes, Prime Minister. In this weather? By God, it makes you proud to be British. And I actually, in case you don't believe Soames, funny enough, I since the publication of this book, I have received a letter from the godson of the poor minister concerned, confirming the story. And I think I've passed it to Alan for it, which I'm sure it will now be included in the Churchill archives in Cambridge. I knew that his career before the Second World War had been very, very far from the failure that some have mistakenly tried to describe it. And he in his pre-war career, he helped found the welfare state. He reformed prisons. He gave British workers job centres and the tea break and unemployment insurance and the living wage, a great scheme, by the way, which we are now expanding in this country. By his invention of the tank and his championing of aviation and his superb work at munitions, he was crucial not just to the action in the First World War, but to Britain's eventual victory. He was indispensable to the foundation of modern Ireland, of Israel, of Jordan, of Iraq, and he had very strong views about Iraq. He described Iraq, you'll remember, as an ungrateful volcano. And he said it was rather living in it. It was like living on an ungrateful volcano. He hated it, and he wished we had never gone there. And I think that if George W. Bush and Tony Blair had studied Winston Churchill before the Gulf War in 2003, it might have been to their advantage. He was also, of course, at the very beginning of the campaign for a united Europe. And this will be a subject of great controversy amongst Churchillians of all kinds, and people read him one way or the other. He's truly biblical in his pronouncements about Europe and Britain's relations with Europe. You can find a text to satisfy virtually any point of view that you wish to advance. And even if we cannot now know exactly what he would have wanted were he in Downing Street today, if we cannot know exactly how Churchill would have pursued the vital renegotiation with our friends and partners in Europe, in Brussels, we can be sure of one thing, or of two things. He would have wanted to have been there himself at the summit, as he called it, a word, a term, an idea that he added to the diplomatic lexicon. And secondly, he would have conducted negotiations in his own superb version of French. And you will remember what he said to General de Gaulle at some critical juncture: "Et marquez mes mots, mon général, si vous me double-crosserez. Je vous liquiderai." I think that's the approach we're going to need in Brussels over the next few months. And it is true that across the modern world you can see traces of his shaping mind, from the very idea of the Middle East to the Cold War, the Iron Curtain. Churchill helped to shape the world that we live in. And the reason he is so important to the world we live in today is that, yes, it is absolutely true that in 1940, and this is the point from which the whole book begins and from which it is suspended, he was the lonely beaver that dammed the flow of events. He was the nail on which destiny snagged her coat. He was the passenger who, as it were, burst through into the cabin of the aircraft and pulled it out of the dive. And if he'd not been there in May 1940, I really think that this country, my country, would have done a deal with Hitler. And if he hadn't been sitting there in that smoke-filled, mullion-windowed little room behind the Speaker's chair on May the 28th, 1940, and if he hadn't added his voice to the councils of Halifax and Chamberlain and Attlee and Greenwood and Sinclair, I really think that Britain would have made an accommodation with evil that would have been absolutely calamitous for European civilization. Because if Britain had folded in 1940, there is every possibility that Hitler might have beaten Russia. And even if Britain had not herself been engulfed, there would have been no prospect of an American entry into the war. Am I not right? There would have been no overlord, there would have been no redemption, there would have been no liberation of the European continent. And it might have been the fate of this country to become the client state, the miserable client state of a racist, murderous, Nazi version of the European Union. And my point in the book is that whatever a Hitlerian victory might have looked like, it did not happen because of that one man. And I hope very much that this book does help to explain not just how he came to be in that room, but also how he came to be that one man. And if you want a final example of the power of his personality, I'll just give you this last story, which I think I also have from the Oracle Soames. It's in the middle of the war, and one evening there was a lady who was a Mrs. Mop at the Ministry of Defence, and she comes down to go home. She walks out of her out of the MOD in Whitehall, and she's going for her bus. She sees something in the gutter. It's a file covered with pink ribbon. It says top secret on it. So she quickly picks it up out of the puddle, tucks it under her raincoat, and takes it home. She's terribly worried. She shows it to her son, who immediately realizes that it must be secret and important. So doesn't open it. He goes straight back to the MOD, and by the time he gets to the ministry, it's of course quite late at night, and everybody's gone home, and they treat him pretty insolently at the door. Nobody comes down to see him, and he insists on seeing someone of flag officer rank, but they're taking absolutely no interest in this poor fellow at all. Finally, somebody comes down and takes the file, and of course, what was it? It's the battle orders for Anzio. Well, the War Cabinet is called the following morning, and they had to work out how serious this breach of security was and whether they could indeed proceed with the Anzio landings, given that their plans had been leaked. And of course, they looked at the file very carefully, and they worked out forensically that it had probably only been in the puddle for a few seconds, and that Mrs. Mop's story, the MOD cleaner's story, was true. So, on balance, they decided to go ahead with the invasion of Italy. And Churchill then turned to the chief of the Imperial General Staff and he said, "Pug, how did this happen?" And Ismay told him about the woman and her son, and as he did so, Churchill began, as he did so often, to cry. "She shall be a Dane commander of the British Empire," he said. "Make it so." And his private secretary, Jock Colville, of course, got on to Tommy Lascelles, the king's private secretary, and see if he could push it through. And alas, it was one of the few things in the war that the king got wrong. Because when the birthday honours came out, she got an MBE, only an MBE. But I am told, and I pass this on to you in all sincerity, when he finally lost office in 1945, in his own resignation honours list, there it was, number 5 on the list, Mrs. Mop, whatever her name was, cleaner at the MOD, DBE. And I'm afraid that story, unlike so many others, has defied all my efforts at verification so far. But I leave it to you, the younger, fitter Churchillian scholars here in this room, to chase it down. But true or not, and I'm sure it is, true or not, I think what it proves, beyond doubt, is the fundamental truth about Winston Churchill's character, that he liked to get his way. And thank God he did. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.